This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Warning, this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen, your host. Since 2010, we've been broadcasting sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, we spotlight diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world. I invite you to listen and change how you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. This episode is part of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide to Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World, produced in collaboration with renowned, fair-minded subject matter experts who provide strategies that enhance critical thinking, increase civic engagement, and foster healthy pleasure to boost personal well-being and relationship satisfaction. You can also discover more unique bonus content at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show, where we are talking about quantitative reasoning, deconstructing political data with my guest, Professor Anthony Fowler. Anthony is a professor in the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He conducts quantitative research on elections and politics. He is a co-author of Thinking Clearly with Data, an editor of the Quarterly Journal of Political Science, and a host of Not Another Politics podcast, launched and produced through the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, providing a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories by focusing on research and data, not pundits and politicians. Welcome, Anthony. I am so glad you're here and so excited to dive in.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to speak with you. It's great to be able to be with your listeners.
Well, so here we are. We are in the hot seat of one of the most important elections of most of our lifetimes. People are on tenterhooks. Guide us through the process of analyzing data in this specific election, because there's so many sources.
There's going to be a lot of that. And actually, my main job is as a political scientist. So I'm very interested in this election. I think there's going to be a lot of pouring through survey data and exit polls and the election returns and trying to understand who voted for who and why. And if things swung from the last election, why did they swing that way? And so there's going to be a lot of that data. I think regular citizens who just want to know more about what's going on, I think they might not do a lot of the data analysis themselves, but they're going to read a lot of reports from data journalists and from academics and experts. And I think it's useful for them to, even if they're not doing the analysis themselves, learn some basic critical thinking skills to be able to identify, here's a good argument, here's a bad argument, and here's a follow-up question that I should ask.
Oh, amen to critical thinking. This is the mantra around here. We want people to think smarter, especially when people are dealing with anxiety and when we are in an anxious, agitated state. Executive functioning seems to go out the window. So we're recording this show pre-election, but it's going to be airing it's airing now after the election, and the outcome is unknown as of this time. So let's just start there.
Sure. We don't know what's going to happen. As a political scientist, I'm interested to see what's going to happen. I'm not going to make any really strong predictions.
No. We don't have crystal balls here.
Sure.
Except we know that half of the people are going to be pretty irritated.
There's going to be some subset of people that are really irritated. Although I think there are also a lot of moderate Americans who are maybe already irritated that these are our two options,
Yeah.
and they're going to be maybe, maybe they have a preference, but they're going to be kind of irritated regardless of who wins. But there's a subset of like really strong partisan extremists who, of course, but I think the vast majority of Americans are actually somewhere in the middle, and they're already a little bit annoyed, and they don't feel as strongly as some of the people that you're hearing from.
So, all right, we're all going to be watching our favorite news channels. Some of us will be watching multiple news channels. Some of us will be getting our election results on social media, right? The source of modern news for a lot of people. Walk us through what we should believe, what we should focus on.
Well, I don't, I mean, I think if you just want to know who won the election, I think you should believe the news reports. Most likely the news reports are going to be reliable, and you'll see what the vote totals were. It could be a contested election. There could be some serious concerns. It could be really close. It could be a Florida 2000 situation where it takes a long time for us to know for sure who won. And even then, there's a lot of debate about, did did Bush only win because of a confusing ballot design and so forth? So there could be things like that, and I think a lot of your listeners will probably be interested in paying attention to that. But if you really want to understand, like, why did something happen, like why did one candidate win versus not, there's going to be a lot of punditry and a lot of commentary and probably a lot of bad arguments that you should be skeptical of. And I think it's useful to think about how would we even know whether some particular strategy worked or not in the election. I think those are going to be the interesting questions for which there's not a clear, decisive answer, and even the media, the journalists won't know for sure.
You bring up a really good point from two different positions. One is the strategy used to get someone elected, and then there is the personal sentiment of what swayed a voter one way versus the other, right? Two separate things.
And these are really hard questions to answer, especially if you're just looking at one election. Like, you look at one election and say, okay, well, why did 2020 go the way that it did? There's a million things that were unique about 2020. It was a global pandemic. You had two very, very well-known, very old white male candidates. You had all kinds of, you could always spin a story as to why the election went one way or another and so forth. And I think that's just not very compelling data analysis to really know, was this strategy effective? We would want some research design where we had variation in that strategy, and we could see, hey, maybe it worked. They did it here and they didn't do it here, and let's actually compare. And so we can get into some of those details if you want, but it's going
Yes.
to be very hard. It's going to be very hard to just look at the one national popular vote and say, okay, this is why Harris either performed better or worse than we might have otherwise expected.
Well, I think, yes, we want to talk about research design, but also talking about how varied this country is. And if you look at what might be the flavor in one state, and I don't mean political flavor, just sort of the culture and the temperature and what resonates with people in one place might not necessarily do so in another. And therefore, that strategy has to be varied, right? It has to meet those people where they're at. And I think that's pretty interesting to me from a psychological point of view, like the psychographics of what makes somebody vote a certain way or believe a certain way.
I think there's certainly some of that, but I think you'd be surprised actually that the states are probably more similar than you think. So when we really dig into the public opinion data and we try to measure, what do people want, what policies do people want from their government? People in San Francisco are probably a little bit more moderate. They're left of center, but they're more moderate than you might expect. And people in Arkansas are also, maybe they're not quite as conservative as you'd expect. And so, for example, we have good data on, for example, the minimum wage. What would you like the minimum wage to be? Most people in San Francisco say maybe $12 would be a good minimum wage, which is much
Wow.
higher than the status quo, but it's much lower than what Democratic politicians are proposing. And if you go to like Fort Worth, Texas, they say, oh, maybe $10. So they're really not that far apart from each other. And it's really the politicians and the elites that are pretty far apart from each other. Maybe that's a topic for another podcast, but that's a really fascinating phenomenon.
That's super interesting. And when we talk about the things that unify us, regardless of where we live, I think that not well, because you have the facts, but my sense is that we do all want the same things, right? We want to have safe housing. We want to be able to put food on the table. We want work that, pays us enough to take care of our families. It's basic needs plus, right? I think that we don't want to just get by. I think if you ask every American, they strive for the same things in that way.
Absolutely, of course, yeah. People, and if we, if you just look historically at survey data, it seems like fundamental economic bread and butter kinds of issues seem to drive vote choice. People vote on the basis of, does this candidate match my economic policy preferences? And do I think they're going to do a good job when it comes to just growing the economy, having lots of jobs, and so forth? Those are the kind of fundamental things that matter. There are some new issues that pop up every once in a while. Immigration is one of those that certainly has become more important in recent elections. But by and large, I think most Americans care about basic bread and butter kind of stuff. They want a prosperous country. They mostly, I mean, they have different values, of course, a little bit, but they also want competent leaders who are going to do a good job. And so I think those voters in the swing states, those working class voters in Pennsylvania, their preferences aren't that radically different from the preferences of the rich educated people who live in San Francisco. They differ a little bit. And so you're right that, the candidates that appeal to them are going to differ, but I think there's also a lot of people, like I said earlier, that are kind of in the middle and think they would like policy to be somewhere to the right of Harris and somewhere to the left of Trump, and they're kind of stuck with the two choices they have.
Let's talk a little bit more about economics because it's very difficult. One cannot measure our economic status today without rolling back the clock and looking in the rearview mirror as to what has happened in the years leading up to this moment. And what I'm talking about specifically is the pandemic and the realization or the acknowledgement that the challenges that we have concerning inflation and such are not just something that happened yesterday, right? It takes a long time for the curve to move.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, empirically, recent economic growth seems to be one of the best predictors of what's going to happen in a presidential election. And if you try to look at different statistics, it seems like, real disposable income is the one that really jumps out as being highly predictive of presidential election results. And so inflation is a big deal because all else equal, higher inflation means lower actual spending capacity, lower consumption, and so forth. But I think most voters, there's some sense that I think one view is that voters are somewhat irrational and they're just thinking about, okay, how are things going right now? I'm going to vote on the basis of that. But I think most voters are also capable of thinking about, this was a difficult situation and so forth. They think about the past, and they're really irrational voters trying to forecast the future. They're trying to
Yeah.
say, if Trump is president versus Harris, what's going to happen in the future? I want whichever president is going to give me better outcomes in the future. And so they're looking at that past to draw that forecast. And you're absolutely right that they should consider the fact that, yes, there was a global pandemic, and so maybe we shouldn't overly penalize Trump for the dip in economic productivity in 2020. Maybe we shouldn't overly penalize Biden for the growth in inflation early in his term and so forth. And they're accounting for that a little bit. But I also think, yeah, so I think you could probably put some blame on both Trump and Biden for the inflation. You could say they both spent tons of money. Some of it was the pandemic, and they had to do that. But so I think that's the challenge that voters are facing. It's not an easy problem, and even the experts are going to disagree a little bit about who's most responsible for inflation and so forth. It's a hard problem voters are facing, but I think they're mostly capable of thinking about these issues and trying to do their best.
This is important, like putting trust in the voter. Not we're not talking about outliers, perhaps, but just sort of the average American has enough common sense to think through what's going to be best, not only for themselves, but for the country moving forward for the short term, right? And
Mhm.
perhaps challenges that we all might face if radical decisions are made.
Yeah, a lot of political scientists don't think very highly of voters. They think they're too partisan. They think they're irrational. They're incompetent, and I just don't find a lot of those studies. I don't find very compelling. I think some of that comes from, I think, just maybe rash conclusions based on not very convincing evidence. One example of this is there are some prominent studies claiming that voters responded to shark attacks in New Jersey in 1916. That the shark attacks in New Jersey helped Woodrow, they hurt Woodrow Wilson's reelection chances because voters thought, oh, the shark attack happened, things went badly, I'm blaming the president. If when you look back at the data, it seems like it's just not true. It just seems like it's one of those false positives where if you hunt around for enough statistical things, you're going to find something that looks like, you're going to find a fluke every once in a while. And so there are lots of examples like that where if you look at the data a little bit more carefully, you see evidence of what looks like multiple testing and selective reporting. I test for 20 things and I only report the one that turns out to be statistically
Ah,
significant. And then I make a big deal about that and I say, look at how irrational the voters are. I think there are a lot of things like that, but on net, I think the voters are perhaps more moderate, not as partisan, and not as irrational as people think.
well, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, let's apply what you've just spoken about to the weather and all of the hurricanes that occurred in the fall of 2024 and how that was weaponized politically. We're going to take a pause. And when we come back, we're going to continue the conversation with my guest today, Professor Anthony Fowler. He is the co-author of Thinking Clearly with Data, a guide to quantitative reasoning and analysis. You can find him over at voices.uchicago.edu/Fowler. That's voices.uchicago.edu/Fowler. Here comes that pause. Harvesting Happiness is rooted in science. Our work facilitates applied positive psychology practices through media and consulting. We're committed to sound ideas for better well-being, leading to increased life satisfaction and a better world for everyone. We're not into pseudoscience or quick fixes. We're focused on common sense backed by rigorous research. Healthy critical thinking is the foundation for our discussions. We encourage you to challenge preconceptions and explore ideas with a curiously discerning mind. Collaboration with our guests is united by an inclusive vision to boost resilience, critical thinking, communication, and problem solving through civilized discourse and pleasurable relational engagement for everyone. Each day, we have the intellectual freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable, regardless of external circumstances. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please seek support because good psychological health is vital to the achievement of a healthy and satisfying life. Visit harvestinghappiness.com for psychosocial and educational services that boost emotional and social intelligence. And we're back, continuing the conversation with my guest, Professor Anthony Fowler. He is the co-author of Thinking Clearly with Data. Anthony, let's get back to it. Prior to the break, we were talking about the shark attacks that occurred in the early 1900s and how there was the mistaken belief that those shark attacks actually swayed an election one way. Now let's pivot to the hurricanes of fall 2024 and how that has been weaponized to allegedly impact how people are stumping, how politicians are stumping in this election season.
Sure. Well, maybe you can tell me more about what you have in mind with these hurricanes, but I'll say a few things. One is this is actually a common thing among political scientists that we look at natural disasters and big weather events and try to look for correlations and so forth. And again, I think you often see these same problems where you test for 20 things and then you find something and you say, aha, that's the particular way in which, right. And so I think a lot of those turn out to be false positives because what it means to have a statistically significant result is if the thing wasn't true, it's unlikely you would have gotten the result that you got, but you should expect that to happen from time to time, even if in fact there's nothing going on. So those kinds of false positives do come up quite a bit. And of course, these natural disasters are always highly politicized. And maybe that's not wrong in some sense, because we do actually, another thing to say about this is we do learn something about the performance of our politicians in natural disasters. So voters don't, it might be the case that a natural disaster does have a big political effect, even if the voters are perfectly rational, because the voters are learning, Ron DeSantis is doing a good or a bad job in responding to the recent hurricane in Florida. I'm learning something about his competence and his ability and his priorities and so forth. That's not wrong for voters to care about that.
That's actually a really good point. And then the other side of the coin is that it's a conspiracy, that the U.S. government has been cloud seeding and causing these natural disasters to impede the election process.
That's a fascinating story. I haven't read much about this. I don't have strong views about the cloud seeding. I will say that, I don't personally have a huge amount of trust in the government, in that it wouldn't shock me if the government was was trying some kind of nefarious thing to, mess with the weather, although they're also not that competent, so they probably wouldn't do it very well.
Oh my
But
gosh.
I'd have to see some pretty compelling evidence to believe this cloud seeding theory before I really bought on. But yeah, so the government does do questionable things all the time. So you shouldn't just trust the government all the time. But I'd have to see some pretty compelling evidence on this particular story.
So the idea that natural disasters, let's go back to them impacting elections and whether they are at the fault of the government or not. Let's like put that sort of conspiracy thing, put a pin in it for 1 minute, and just talk about the impact of on election day, for example. Like, I can understand if there's a big hurricane that comes on election day and it's disastrous in one region of the country, how that really impacts things. That makes total sense. But a natural disaster that occurs that just happens to be during election season, I'm not sure I buy it. How do we know?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the way you would try to learn is by studying lots of natural disasters over a long period of time, looking at data, ideally with a compelling research design where you're accounting for the fact that different places vote differently from each other and there could be effects over time. So there are ways of trying to study this. And I think, there are often these claims that, oh, natural disasters, they help the Democratic Party or they hurt the incumbents and so forth. And after that data has been reanalyzed, very often we find out that the evidence was never that convincing and probably the effects were small. You're right that the day of the election, there probably is an effect. There's a clear turnout
Of
effect. So if
course.
there's bad weather on election day, there's a turnout effect. It historically probably has hurt the Democratic Party more because those marginal voters that are more sensitive to the cost of voting are more likely to be Democratic voters. Although that might change in the future as the educated class is becoming more democratic and so forth. So there's lots of things to talk about there. But as far as just generally bad weather and disasters having big political effects, there's not a lot of evidence that that's true. But I will continue to say, even if it is true, even if it were true, it wouldn't necessarily mean that the voters are irrational because voters do learn something about the quality of their government from these disasters.
Point well taken. And I do like the point that you made about Governor DeSantis and how he was conducting himself and what people learned from that, because it seemed like, he's doing what he needs to do. So that's a good thing. And we want that from our elected officials, right? We want them to put the rhetoric aside and act like leaders. I mean,
Mhm.
that is what we all hope for.
Yes, no, that's right. And they don't always do that. Sometimes
Right.
they're very, I think most incumbents are already kind of positively selected. We voted for them because we like them, and so we
Yeah.
already think positively about them. And if I just think theoretically about this, that means that more information on net is actually bad for incumbents because they don't want you to learn something that could potentially, so it could be that most incumbents are good and most of the time natural disasters don't change the outcome of the election, but on average a natural disaster is going to be bad for incumbents because more information is bad for them, and the bad ones would like you to not learn that they're bad, and the disaster helps you learn that they're bad. And sometimes this happens, and I think even some of this recent discussion over FEMA funding, I think has been somewhat informative for voters to think, well, is Homeland Security really being well run? Is President Biden really on top of this, or things, or are things not being well managed? So I think this is useful for voters.
Or have there been so many natural disasters in the past few years? And I'm going back now thinking about what happened in Hawaii, and that was really a huge disaster, that fire,
Mhm.
or the disasters that have occurred in California because of the wildfires of the past couple of years. That the coffers are only so full and we can only handle so many natural disasters. And is the lack of appropriate funding as a result of more natural disasters or mishandling by the government? And how do we know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something the voters are going to have to figure out for themselves. I
Yeah.
think a lot of voters. I don't think voters sitting around saying, "I wish the government could spend more trillions of dollars." I think
Right.
they're largely upset about how those trillions are being spent, and things like this certainly make that more salient for voters. When we see that they're spending so much money in other areas and they say we don't have enough resources to come help the people in Florida or North Carolina or Hawaii or Puerto Rico, that's pretty disappointing for a lot of people.
And conversely, you have rhetoric out there saying don't file for FEMA benefits because the US government wants to eminent domain your property. I mean, like really nonsense.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think it's hard to say. I mean, I understand the impulse, I guess, right? I understand the impulse of like be wary of the government, but also when the government is actually helping people, like we want to get that support out there to people. So it's a challenge. Yeah.
And I think something that we forget as average citizens is these men and women, these people, they work for us. They are our employees. Our tax dollars are paying for these people. And it's something that I think often goes undiscussed, right? There's a power play. They're the leaders, they must know better. But we put them there. And if we don't like who's working for us, we can replace them.
I mean, that's the crux of these debates
Yes.
over Schedule F and how much control should the president have over the bureaucracy. And I think that's Trump's argument, actually. Trump's argument is there are all these unelected bureaucrats who aren't acting on behalf of the public. And you can agree or disagree about the extent of that problem. And Trump is saying, I would like the opportunity to fire these people if they're doing a bad job. And again, I'm not necessarily endorsing that view, but that's a real tension. I think there are a lot of voters saying they should be working for us and they should be accountable to us.
Let's go back to a little bit of the smoke and mirror effect and how data gets turned into belief or lack of data gets turned into belief.
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of ways this can happen. I mean, there are a lot of ways that data can be either just that misleading arguments can be made. So I'll give you one common example. So here's something your listeners can learn to look out for. So there's a common mistake that analysts make called selecting on the dependent variable. So this is going to sound technical and jargony for a second, but I'll try to explain it. So very often some analysts might come along and they'll say, "Oh, I wanted to study some phenomenon." So a famous example that we talk about in our book is Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers book.
Love
You've
that.
probably okay.
Yeah.
So Malcolm Gladwell says, I want to understand what makes people really successful. So I'm going to go study all the cases of success, and I'm going to figure out what the commonalities are among all these successful people. That turns out to be a bad idea, even though that's basically
Really?
the crux of Gladwell's book. And the reason it's a bad idea is that you're selecting, so the dependent variable is just a jargony term for like the outcome that we care about. You're selecting your cases based on the outcome. And that means there's no variation in that outcome. And so Gladwell goes around and says, "Oh, I talked to all these successful people." And it turns out they all practice really hard. They put in lots of hours. They put in their 10,000 hours. And therefore, that's the key to success. But he never talked to any unsuccessful people. And so we don't even know if there's a correlation between practice and success because we only talk to people who are successful.
You make a really good point. I mean, there are many people out there who have been practicing for 10,000 hours or more that may not be successful. And why not? Right? Is it simply because maybe they didn't have the aptitude really for what they were doing, or they didn't have the social capital that
Absolutely.
supported them or
Exactly.
mentored them along the way? You make a really good point, which is a little bit scary in the sense like you shouldn't always think and believe everything that you see, read, and hear.
Right. And so you'll see this kind of thing a lot. You'll see if you look out for it, if you know to look out for it, you'll recognize it a lot. Some journalists will say, "I wanted to understand why people voted for Trump." And so I went to rural Pennsylvania and I talked to a bunch of Trump supporters and they said X, Y, and Z. But those could be sentiments that are actually quite popular among the general public. And that's not really why they voted for Trump. Maybe they voted for Trump for some other reason. And it's a common pervasive problem in lots of areas, right? Your doctor does this all the time. Your doctor mostly talks to sick people, right? So the back pain doctor mostly talks to people with back pain, and they learn what the commonalities are among people with back pain, and they don't even know if those are common in the general population or are they actually indicators of serious back pain.
But it's the common denominator in that bubble. Really, it's about analyzing that bubble, right? The back doctor is in a world where there's a lot of back pain, so
Right.
that's their bubble.
But what would be even more useful is if they did a lot of comparing of people with and without back pain, so they could say, "Oh,
Right.
this is the thing." And it turns out, I mean, that this isn't just a made up example. So herniated discs are often thought to be a cause of back pain. And the reason is that when you do an MRI on somebody with back pain, about 2/3 of them have herniated discs. And then at some point, some researchers published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine where they decided, let's do the same test on just other people who don't have back pain. And it turns out that 2/3 of those people also have herniated discs. So it turns out that herniated discs aren't even correlated with back pain, let alone causing back pain. So again, this is a very common problem where somebody essentially is cherry picking their cases based on the outcome. And even if they're well-meaning, I have no reason to think that Malcolm Gladwell wasn't well-meaning. He was trying to learn about what causes success,
Oh,
but
yeah.
he collected his data set in a way that didn't even allow him to compare and learn about the correlates of success.
We are out of time on this episode, but we're going to continue this conversation of our bonus edition on more mental fitness. To learn more about the work of Professor Anthony Fowler, please go to voices.uchicago.edu/Fowler. Again, that's voices.uchicago.edu/Fowler. We're talking about elements of his book that he has co-authored, Thinking Clearly with Data, A Guide to Quantitative Reasoning and Analysis. Anthony, I cannot wait to continue this conversation.
Great, me too. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen on behalf of my guest, Anthony Fowler, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day and remember to be kind to one another. Want to explore more sound ideas for better well-being? You can listen to part 2 of this conversation and the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide to Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by Lisa Cypers Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the excellent team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.